Welcome to the Book Review Podcast. I'm Gilbert Cruz, the new editor of the Books Desk, and for the next many months, we'll be highlighting great interviews from our decade-plus archive. Why are we doing that? Well, we're planning a new iteration of this podcast, and as a result, we'll be using the rest of the year to figure out what that might sound like. Until then, we hope you enjoy these trips down memory lane. This week, we have two conversations for you. In 2017, Andrew Sean Greer released his comic novel Less. The following year, to his great surprise, it won the Pulitzer Prize. He found out this news from the author Michael Chabon while at a writer's residency in Tuscany after having put a diaper on a pug. That's just one of the many delightful details in our new profile from Greer, which was written by Alexandra Alter. Greer's new book, Less is Lost, is a sequel to that prize-winning novel. And we're using this as an opportunity to look back on a conversation that he had 5 years ago with then book review editor Pamela Paul. Our second conversation is from 2015. That's when we spoke to William Finnegan, the New Yorker staff writer, about his memoir Barbarian Days, which details his life traveling through many parts of the world chasing his surfing obsession. I don't know how to swim, let alone surf, which is probably why I tore through this book 7 years ago and was compelled to highlight it now.
Andrew Sean Greer joins us now. His new novel is called Less, and it is on the cover of the New York Times Book Review this week. Andy, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, this is a book about a failed novelist. You are not a failed novelist. What drew you to this foreign creature?
I think it's not hard for any novelist to consider themselves failed at any point. Even the greatest writers I know, they feel like they're on the outside because I think you're alone all the time, so you're sure you've just lost it every day.
And a failed novelist is sort of not a foreign creature in the world of letters. Like, what's the draw of that kind of character?
Because it's such an enormous amount of vanity to be a novelist, it's easy to pierce it at any moment, and comically, I think. Because the whole thing is something you're making, and no one wants to read it. You're certain of it. So at many times, it's just feels tragic, but actually it's kind of funny when you look back.
And this is your sixth book.
This is my sixth book.
Did you consider this to be a kind of break from what you were doing earlier, or is it sort of on a natural continuum with your previous novels?
I think it's a break. I think if I were classier, I'd say, like, you don't see the line going through. But for me, I actually started off writing one of my normal, poignant, wistful novels, and I just thought, I just can't do it anymore. I just don't feel like it.
You don't feel poignant anymore?
I think I was too depressed to write something sad.
When did you start writing?
This book?
Yeah.
Probably 3 years ago. 3 years ago.
Why were you depressed?
Oh, I just... Why was I depressed? I think I wasn't happy with my last book, with how it was received. Vanity, again, because actually it did really great. But in my mind, people weren't showing up to readings. And so I got really down and I thought, I'm going to write a book about a sad writer. And like, no one can really feel sorry for that dude. Like a middle-aged white guy who can't write his book is not a sad story. So instead, I turned it around and it was much more fun to write that way.
This is a real comic novel.
Yeah, I hope so.
Tell us what it's about.
It's about this failed writer on the cusp of turning 50. His old lover has left him and is marrying someone else, and to escape the wedding, which would be humiliating, and to escape not going to the wedding, which would be obvious to people, he accepts every invitation he finds in his mail, which is to a series of bizarre conferences and teaching gigs and travel posts that leads him on a trip around the world.
So where does Arthur Less go?
He starts in New York, which to me is traveling, but not to a New Yorker, Mexico City, France, Italy, Berlin, Morocco, India, Japan, and home to San Francisco.
And did you go to all these places, or had you been to all these places to kind of research the novel?
To try to make money, I was turning into a travel writer, but I
thought you were going to say you were going to all these conferences too.
I wasn't going to the conferences. I was going on much less exotic trips, although the places were exotic. And because I was alone, I would just take notes on every detail I saw. And so my rule for myself for this book was that I couldn't put in any detail I hadn't written in my notes, that I hadn't actually seen, because I didn't want a fantasy of a foreign place. I wanted the things I actually saw.
Well, you are familiar with foreign places because you live half in San Francisco and half in Tuscany.
That's right. Yeah, I do.
That sounds like perfect, is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's strange to move your life. I'm a director of a writer's residency outside of Tuscany. And so I lead this sort of other life with pugs and writers and a lot of red wine.
That sounds torturous.
Yeah, it's a really hard life. No one suffers the way I do.
The book is about Americans abroad and sort of expatriate life, too. So I'm sure your own experience informed that to some degree.
Well, I found funny things happening all the time, and they were always my fault because I was the thing out of place with terrible misperceptions about what was supposed to happen, how toilets flushed or how subways worked or almost anything. So I kept making mistakes and everyone was very kind to me. So I put them down and gave all of the details to Arthur, although all of the characters are inventions and situations.
All right, well, tell us some of those funny stories, yours, and then how they sort of changed when they became Arthur's.
One that doesn't seem particularly funny is the trouble getting the VAT system. You know, when you buy something in Europe.
Oh, my God.
You get your tax back if you can figure it out.
It's so hard.
Have you ever done that?
I have actually done it. I've done it, but I was successful on about like 30% of the receipts. And so, felt mournful about the 70% that I just didn't quite get right.
I mean, you have to like wear the items to the customs department and show them that it's this bizarre process. You have to kind of have them and prove you bought them. You have to find the customs office. That you have to stamp it.
It's hidden.
It's hidden. Once they do it, they don't take it. You have to mail it. You have to put it in a special box. I've done the whole thing right and then put it in a trash can by mistake that I thought was a mailbox in France. You have to stamp it at the place you're leaving Europe, which once for me was Greece. And the whole thing was closed, and there was a sort of Sybil in a cage I had to get to her to get her to look it through and stamp it. But I did once, the last time, managed to get the whole thing back.
Wow. It's one of those processes that I feel like everyone who's involved with it seems to know what they're doing, but in fact often doesn't. So the people in the stores who are selling it, I don't know, my experience is often in France, where they'll sort of like, some of them have special envelopes that each have a kind of different way of doing it. And the truth is, I think that none of them understand it either.
Yeah, they're all sure that it's going to work out fine because they only do that particular portion. I once had everything right, but the envelope I got was stamped Ireland. And so they wouldn't accept it because the things I bought were in Italy, and I kind of lost my cool.
Can you write an entire novel about this, please?
It's in here. I put it into the book. He has trouble.
How does it?
Well, I just wanted him to lose his mind. And so he lost his mind. He bought some ridiculous item in Italy with some prize money he gets. And then he tries to go through the whole system and fails, and he's at the end of his rope. And then the flight he's taking, which is to Marrakesh, announces that it's willing to give 600 euros to anyone who will take the flight later that night. And he's like, I'm your man. Feels like that's the salvation. He gets 600 euros back that he couldn't get with the VAT. And then suddenly he spends the day in Paris.
So we can say that the book is about a failed novelist. We can say that it's also a satire of Americans abroad. What's it really about to you?
It's just going to sound so sappy. It's really about love and figuring out what that really is. Not just like strangers who say they love you, like who love writers in some way. And the way it changes over time, an old love relationship and a new one, and whether love is the good dear thing you have with a spouse over years and, they don't mind if you make a mess in the kitchen, or whether it's some lightning strike that's supposed to happen and you drop everything and run off.
So this is sounding now like one of your earlier poignant moving novels, yet you did it through comedy.
There is a through line, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it to me, it's the same concerns about love and the passage of time.
How different was it to do that in a comic novel?
Weirdly, it's the same thing. You put your character in a situation that upends their expectations. And in a serious novel, it leads to self-doubt and introspection. And in a comic novel, it leads to pratfall. The very same story. I don't know if the VAT would be a touching story in a serious novel. But, at one point he takes a sleeping pill just before he's landing in Frankfurt and has to make his way through the airport and gets into the wrong car waiting for him, which I guess that could lead to tragedy in a thriller or something like that. Mm-hmm. But this one, of course, it's just humiliation as he goes to the wrong
So
hotel.
we here at the Book Review know that you can write with comic flair because you review for us, and I've reviewed funny books and have just written reviews that have that element to it. But why did you not write a comic novel earlier, do you think?
That's a good question. People ask me that because when I when I do my readings, I guess I'm kind of funnier than anyone is expecting me to be.
They're expecting you to be poignant and moving?
Yeah, but how could you be that on stage all the time? That would be a drag. I think I took myself a little too seriously before. Not that I'm not proud of all of those books. And I think I finally decided not to. I think that's middle age, where you just think, we're not improving this person you are. So all we can do is laugh at the problems. And maybe I reached that.
Do you think you're going to continue in this vein?
I would love to. It was a blast. Yeah.
Was it harder in any way to write a comic novel than to work in that earlier mode?
No, because you could get away with bad sentences and things because they were meant to be clunky because it was funnier that way. It was much more freeing. I feel like people wouldn't, because when you write something really serious, if you go too far into sentiment, people reject it. But in a comic novel, you're kind of hoping you're going to get to sentiment in some way because you have to reward this poor character who's being tortured.
But tortured for a good cause.
A good cause. Literature.
Well, literature, yes. And it's being published in summer. Did you think of this as a kind of more of an entertainment in a way when you were working on it?
I like the way Graham Greene would talk about, he would alternate between his serious novels and his entertainments. Now it's hard to see the difference sometimes in those books of his. And I prefer his entertainments, honestly. So yeah, I guess I thought of it that way. It's only published in summer because I'd left Tuscany 3 days ago, and they planned the pub date for when I could finally make it to the States.
You wanted to be in New York during the sweatiest, muggiest time of the year.
I get to wear new clothes.
Well, there's a lot to persuade people to read the novel. It is, as I mentioned, on the cover of the book review. The blurb from Gary Steingart on the front of the book says, marvelously, unexpectedly, endearingly funny. And Nell Zink says you will sob little tears of joy. But if I had to ask you, and there's many, many more exciting and fun blurbs on the back, but if I had to ask you to kind of sell someone on picking up this book right now and reading it, what would you say to them?
I would say that you're really going to enjoy yourself, and then you're going to bawl at the end.
Well, that's the best thing you can do with the book,
Well, that's
isn't
what
it?
I like from a book.
Andy, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
William Finnegan joins us now. He is a staff writer at The New Yorker and the author of a new book, Barbarian Days, A Surfing Life, reviewed this week in the book review. Hi there.
Hi.
So this is, in certain ways, an expansion of an article you wrote in The New Yorker about 25 years ago called Playing Doc's Games.
Yes.
Tell us about that original story.
Well, I was living in San Francisco, surfing at Ocean Beach. Is kind of a crazy, cold, scary spot off San Francisco with this physician, Mark Renneker is his name, who was a really sort of charismatic, big wave surfer. So I had a notion to write a piece about him and proposed it to The New Yorker. I was freelancing in those days and got the assignment. But the piece took me 7 years to write. I'd never written about surfing before, although I'd done it all my life. I'd never really thought how to try to communicate about surfing to non-surfing readers. I had other inhibitions and struggles with that piece, but I finally got it done, and it was published in 1992. I got a strangely big reaction.
Why strange?
I don't know. I was writing about all these serious topics. You know, I was turning out books and articles on apartheid in those days and civil wars and you know, serious topics. And then I did this relatively light piece about surfing, and that was the one people got really excited about.
They didn't care about the drug cartels in Mexico or South Africa nearly as much.
Not in the same way. And in fact, that piece had a strangely long afterlife. I still, to this day, people hear I surf and they bring up that piece and start talking about it to me. I even had people in the water. I don't know at all. It happened recently in Mexico. A guy started talking to me about that piece in the water in Mexico. And of course, when I say, "Oh, I wrote that," you know, nobody believes me. It partly cued me that there was maybe something more to be done there, and that I could perhaps write about. I mean, I've had this very intense 50-year surfing life now, and that I could perhaps write about my life through the lens of surfing.
What's the challenge in writing about surfing?
Well, there are various. I mean, just to keep, say, non-surfing readers turning the pages is a challenge. You've got to get them out in the water. This is for the actual surfing passages, which is probably a minority of the pages. In fact, I know it is a minority of the pages in this book. But for the surfing sections, you've got to really get people out in the water, keep them oriented, which is kind of a trick, and then really give them a stake in the outcome. From what I've heard, that's worked for a lot of non-surfers, feel like they've been out in the water for the first time.
As a writer, when you were approaching this book, did you think of it as I'm writing a memoir, or did you think of it as I'm writing a book about surfing?
Memoir. I wasn't interested in, writing the history of surfing or about professional surfing or surf stars or any of that sort of stuff. That comes in tangentially here and there. But I really wanted to try to get at the thing itself, my own experience of it as a kind of hardcore surfer, hardcore kid. I was kind of a feral traveler for a number of years, just really obsessed with finding waves. And then I've tried to continue, and I still surf as much as I can. I surfed yesterday. I try to integrate it into my life as an adult, which is a trick.
Where do you surf now?
Well, yesterday on Long Island. If the wind had been more west, it would have been New Jersey, and it depends on the conditions.
You grew up in California and Hawaii, two big surfing enclaves. How did you get introduced to surfing? Did your father surf?
No, my father didn't surf, but he was a mad sailor, and we just spent a lot of time at the beach of Southern California, and a friend and his family surfed, and I spent summers with them. And it was in Newport Beach, California. And I just, you start with body surfing. I mean, the main thing with surfing to learn is to get really comfortable in the ocean, to know the ocean. So I sort of spent my childhood in the ocean. In fact, really, reading waves is reading them well, reading them correctly is the most important thing, much more than writing them. If you haven't got the reading down, the writing will never happen. Was it
an immediate passion for you?
Yes. I loved being in the water and being in waves. And then the first time I stood up on a surfboard was kind of a revelation. Yeah. I got more obsessed when we moved to Hawaii, and then it really became a kind of, I was raised Catholic, and after my confirmation when I was 13, my parents gave me the choice to not go to Mass, much to my shock. And I stopped and kind of left the church, and surfing really filled a gap there for me.
What year was this?
1966 or 67, 66.
And so for those not in the surfing world, is there a kind of golden age of surfing, or is that specific to different areas? And what was it like in Hawaii in the 60s as a surfer?
Well, for me, it was absolutely wonderful. The waves were better, bigger, the surfers were better.
How could the waves be better? Because a non-surfer thinks like waves are waves. I mean, how did they go from being better to worse?
You could rate waves sort of 1 to 100, and you could argue whether that's a 56 or a 55. I mean, they're crummy waves, small onshore winds, not much fun to ride. And then there are great waves that are, absolutely ecstatic experiences. They're bigger, they're hollower, they're more powerful, they're more regularly peeling. One could go on and on about.
Oh, but when you said the waves were better, did you mean the waves were better then, or the waves were better there?
Oh, I'm sorry. The waves were better there.
Oh, okay. So I thought the waves in Hawaii were no longer as good as they were in that golden era. Okay.
No. You asked about a golden era. It's a good question because there's a lot of nostalgia that comes with surfing, even with little kids. I mean, when I was a little kid, we were all very nostalgic for an era we'd missed, when it was less crowded, when there was nobody at Malibu, and big days at Rincon were 3 guys out, and everybody does that to this day. And so when I read about surfing in the 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of surfers read this stuff and say, "Oh my God, you were there for the dawn of discovery. You were there for the golden age." But I'm not the least bit nostalgic about it, and people are surprised when they read that, because I kept voluminous journals from those days. Those are kind of a reality check on the nostalgia. It was crowded even then at the more famous places, and I was very, very lucky to surf some of the great waves in the world early in their. I mean, before they were discovered or before they were well known, and I celebrate those pretty lyrically in here. But in general, if there was a golden age, it was long before my time.
Well, it's like backpacking. You were never there when You're always there after.
Yes.
What was the culture in Hawaii of surfing? How is it different from California, where you'd been before?
It was distinctly different. My best friends there when I was a kid were some Hawaiian brothers, the Kalakakuis, whose dads surfed, and it was clearly quite deep tradition in their family and in their world. And it wasn't at all oppositional. I think surfing's got a lot less kind of association with juvenile delinquency now. Lots of yuppies and professionals of different kinds surf now. Some people say it's yoga or golf.
It's become corporatized.
Yeah. But when I was a kid, certainly in Southern California, I think on the East Coast too, the authorities were not happy to see you surfing. There were beach towns that banned surfing. You'd never have had a surfing team in the high school. It was for little bad kids, cool kids. But it wasn't that in Hawaii at all. It was much more deeply woven into the fact. It's the birthplace of surfing. It's where surfing started, Hawaii, and it still had that feeling in the place. And I'd never been around that before. It wasn't one of the many joys of moving. And the water's warmer, and the waves were bigger, and I learned a lot. My surfing sort of jumped ahead by living in Hawaii when I was young.
You then traveled for many years. Was that driven by surfing? Was it driven by work? Was it just personal?
It was mostly driven by surfing. I had finished graduate school and had saved a little money. I was working on the railroad in California, and it almost felt mandatory. It's almost like I didn't think I had an option as, I've saved some money. Now is the time to go on the huge surf trip. And I was gone nearly 4 years, most of it in the Southern Hemisphere, just looking for waves. But I had a lot of jobs, different jobs on that, keep me going. My savings soon ran out. Looking back on it, it was a pivotal year I spent in South Africa, teaching in a black high school near Cape Town. I later wrote a book about that.
What year was that?
That was 1980. It was a really intense year. The kids went out on strike for a few months, protesting apartheid in education. It got very violent. A lot of people were hurt and killed in the community where I worked. And I actually came out of that experience. I was writing fiction up till then. I was, at the time, working on a novel. And I came out of that experience just only interested in political journalism and started writing for a living after that and doing, nonfiction and sort of taught myself to be a journalist and freelancing then, and I've basically been a political journalist ever since.
And was your surfing life, did you consider that a hobby, or did you ever think of it as something you wanted to write about, or was that purely separate from your... It
was purely separate. I couldn't imagine writing about it. I almost felt like I had nothing to say about it, that it was a private thing, that it was something I'd always done, and there was nothing to say. But then came that assignment to write about the fellow in San Francisco, and
so that wasn't your idea.
It was my idea, but what happened was I was freelancing at the time, and I sent to the New Yorker a little column, political thing over the transom. It was about Nicaragua, where I'd just gone on assignment for another magazine, and they took it. Somebody in the editor's office, William Shawn was the editor then, said, it'd be a good time to propose a big piece, to get an assignment here. I thought, okay. And I felt like I had to do it that afternoon. I didn't have any other ideas. And here I was surfing with this guy who was like a John McPhee hero, this big, charismatic, sort of outdoor Superman. And so I just proposed this John McPhee piece, and they said, sure, fine. And I'm not John McPhee. I couldn't write that. So it took me years to figure out what to write. And that's when I first started thinking about writing about surfing. But and I actually had an ongoing dialogue with that guy who was the most obsessive, devoted surfer I've ever known. He was absolutely, and he still is to this day.
Earlier, you referred to him as a big wave surfer.
Yeah.
What's a big wave surfer as opposed to just a surfer?
There's a very small percentage of surfers who chase really, really big waves, and they seem to me to be kind of built of different stuff. They don't seem to have the basic fight or flight instinct that the rest of us have. So I write a lot about surfing bigger waves in this book, but I'm not a big wave surfer. I have normal amounts of fear, I think.
What constitutes a big wave as opposed to just one that probably looks big to people who aren't surfing it?
Yeah, it's all relative, of course, and all surfers have a kind of upper limit, the waves, what they're willing to surf, and it's big to them. And what's big to me, to a big wave surfer is laughable.
What's big to you?
what's big to me is a wave that I think can drown me. It's usually 2, 3, 4 times overhead as you stand up, and it breaks really hard, often in shallow water. Deeper water, safer. It's strange. I've kind of got more interested in bigger waves in middle age. And it's a little bit of a compensation. My sort of small wave skills are deteriorating with age. I can feel it. And that gets blurred in bigger waves. It's a different thing, and I can still do it. And I also seem to panic a little less than I used to in big waves. And you see really incredible, just beautiful, beautiful things out in the water when it's big that you can't see from shore.
Surfing seems like one of those sports where, you used the word sort of chasing earlier when you were talking about traveling, where like mountain climbing or scuba diving, it's as much about the location and the biggest, the deepest. Do you see it that way? Do they seem to fit a similar category?
Well, it certainly is about location, about place, not necessarily the superlatives, the biggest, the deepest. Most surfers, if you just glance and see surfers down at the end of the street out in the water, they're all engaged in the same sort of basic occupation, which is trying to read the waves, trying to understand what they're doing and what they're going to do. And it's incredibly complex. Different breaks are different, but it changes all the time, with the tide, with the wind, with the swell, with the angle of the swell, size of the swell, and down to, every eddy, like individual rocks. Guys are trying to understand, usually their local spot. It's this profound absorption in the immediacies of that place. And I've, sort of devoted myself to a number of places over the years, and that's a lot of what I write about. So in that sense, yeah, it's like as with rock climbing or something, it's, that rock is very, very important. Don't underestimate it. Don't misjudge it.
It sounds like an art and a science. Is the whole idea of surfers as kind of being these laid back, dudes, sort of stoner guys, a misconception or?
No, there are many such guys all over the world now. But it's also true that every surfer is an oceanographer of a quite dedicated, applied kind. And you can, in usually the slang of surfing, have a very detailed conversation about especially their local spots. And these are longitudinal studies over long periods of time. Guys that devote years to understanding what a wave does at a certain place, or what waves can do at that place, so that they can be in the right spot and ride them well.
Everyone has their own level of comfort with risk, and what seems like a risk-taking sport, bungee jumping or ski jumping, to someone doesn't seem risky to the person involved. Do you think of surfing as a very risky sport? Is it dangerous to you?
That's not how I think about it, no. There are plenty of ways to get hurt, hit by your board or somebody else's board, or hit the bottom, or get held down. But it's much more, my surfing, I can really mainly speak for my surfing, it's all about this experience of beauty, this really sort of certain kind of drenched experience and beauty. And the physical risks are very much footnotes.
Well, I'm still scared, but not of reading about it. The book again is Barbarian Days, A Surfing Life.
Those were our conversations with Andrew Sean Greer from 2017 and William Finnegan from 2015. We'll have more from the Book Review Podcast Archive next week. I'm Gilbert Cruz. Thank you for listening.